Hey everyone, my name's Tyler Freed, and I am a student in the master's program at Tiffin University pursuing some further education in criminal behavior and criminal justice. My research project for this course was childhood trauma and criminal behavior as it correlates to aggression, because a lot of aggressive behavior is considered criminal in nature. First off, I'd like to mention that throughout my career, I've worked with individuals who have experienced considerable amounts of abuse and neglect, specifically children ages about 5 to 12, and due to their abuse and neglect, they display a lot of aggressive behavior. Scientific understanding of this is that they have increased cortiolimbic activation and amygdala reactivity to everyday stimuli, so essentially they're responding disproportionately to different things because they're processing it through the fight or flight part of their brain instead of through their executive functioning. As you're all likely aware, most aggressive behavior is considered to be criminal in nature, including things like assault, battery, rape, and property destruction. There are, of course, other displays of behavior that are aggressive in nature and considered criminal, and so I'd like to look at the correlation between trauma, aggression, and criminal behavior. It has also been found in past research that males are historically more aggressive than females, and so comparing responses between males and females was another thing that I was interested in. So to start, I'd like to point out that there has been a past study done with about 500 prisoners in Italy, and all of the participants that were interviewed mentioned that they experienced some sort of childhood trauma, whether that was abuse or neglect or other types of experiences that they considered to be childhood trauma. There's also additional findings on types of aggression between males and females. Women historically are shown to display more indirect forms of aggression, whereas males are more likely to show physical aggression. And then also scientifically, cortisol and testosterone increases in males are noted to be significant indicators of more frequent aggression. And this is something that I would like to look further into. There's also a thing called ACE scores, which some of you may be familiar with. ACE, spelled ACE, stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and a lot of research in this category has found that experience and exposure to these conditions is often correlated with higher likelihood of incarceration, higher likelihood of mental health dysfunction, and other detrimental impacts to an individual's development. And now I'd like to discuss my empirical questions. The first thing I want to answer is, does exposure to childhood trauma in the form of abuse or neglect predict likelihood of aggression as it relates to criminal behavior? And then I'd also like to see if the results vary based on gender. So to conduct this study, I used a 2x2 factorial between persons and a non-repeated measure design. The research was gathered using a survey from the aggression questionnaire, which I was provided by the instructor. Essentially, people were asked a series of questions that would indicate types of aggression, such as, my friends see me as a hothead, or I have gotten so mad before that I have physically broken something, or I have punched people before, and respondents are tasked with ranking 1 through 5 on the questionnaire. And then at the end, I added a couple extra questions. One of them was to determine if the participant had experienced childhood trauma, and then I also asked for them to indicate their gender, which for the purposes of this study was just whatever the respondent was assigned at birth. So to summarize the results, I'd like to point out that when looking at the 5 categories that these questions were broken down into, so we have verbal aggression, hostility, anger, physical aggression, and indirect aggression. Those who experienced childhood trauma had higher scores in 4 out of those 5 categories. The only one that it was lower was verbal aggression. And then these next 2 slides are going to be comparing males and females with trauma as well as without trauma, so that we could sort of categorize them in ranking of most aggressive to least aggressive. So my 4 categories being males with trauma, males without trauma, females with trauma, and females without trauma. And you'll see down when we get to the discussion what I was able to discover. So after averaging all of the responses for those 4 categories of participants that I mentioned previously, I was able to confirm something that I had speculated and then also something that I hypothesized. So what I hypothesized was that the males with childhood trauma would be the most aggressive overall, which did prove to be true. What I also hypothesized, though, was that the overall group of individuals with trauma would be the most aggressive. And what I speculated about was that males overall would be more aggressive than females overall. And what we found was that males with childhood trauma were the most aggressive. Males without childhood trauma were the second most aggressive. Females with childhood trauma were the third most aggressive, and females without childhood trauma were the least aggressive. So this is interesting because my hypothesis stated that males and females with childhood trauma will report higher scales of aggression compared to both groups without childhood trauma. And I put that it was an interesting possibility that males without childhood trauma would rank higher than females with childhood trauma, since males overall have higher displays of aggression. I put that I didn't expect this. It actually ended up being true. So all things considered, my research was able to discover that, yes, males are more aggressive than females, and then trauma does influence a higher likelihood of aggression. Something else that I found interesting was that the one category that women ranked higher than men in was indirect aggression. And in the past research that I had mentioned and written about, it was noted that, just as I found, women are generally less aggressive than men, except for when it comes to that indirect aggression. And sure enough, questions that include things like, I give people the silent treatment when I'm upset, or I will purposely take my time doing something if people are being controlling, those would indicate indirect aggression, and sure enough, women ranked higher than that. So all things considered, I would say that my research was important to the future just because it helps me figure out how I can best serve individuals with trauma. I wouldn't say there should be more attention given to boys versus girls, but I would say that early intervention, identification, and being aware of all these possibilities will be helpful.